The rifle jammed on the second volley. Private First Class Tyler Henderson had raised the M1 Garand to his shoulder, aligned with the other 6 members of the ceremonial firing line, and squeezed the trigger. Instead of the sharp crack that should have punctuated the November air, there was only a hollow metallic click. His face went white. The other rifles fired around him, the reports echoing across Memorial Park, but his weapon stayed silent, the bolt frozen halfway back. He tried to stay at attention, barrel angled skyward, but his hands betrayed him with a visible tremor. The NCO, standing to the left of the formation, glanced over, uncertainty rippling across his face. Before anyone could issue a command or signal halt, an older man in a faded olive field jacket stepped out from behind the front row of folding chairs. He moved directly toward Henderson with a controlled limp, ignoring a startled protest from Sergeant Eric Nolan near the rope line. "May I?" The man's voice was quiet, gravelly, but carried an unmistakable authority that made Henderson hand over the rifle without thinking. If you're watching this story from anywhere in the world, we'd love to know where you're joining us from. Drop a comment below telling us your city or country. The man took the rifle with both hands, tilting it slightly away from the crowd, and performed a series of movements so fluid they looked rehearsed, checking the chamber, cycling the action with a sharp pull that seated the bolt correctly, extracting a spent casing that had failed to eject, and reinserting the clip with a practiced press of his thumb. The entire process took less than 15 seconds. He handed the weapon back to Henderson, then stepped into a position just behind the firing line and called out in a parade ground voice that cut through the cold air without shouting. "Ready. Aim. Fire." The third volley erupted in perfect unison, 7 rifles this time, the sound rolling across the park and fading into the tree line beyond. Lieutenant Colonel Karen Whitfield stood frozen at the portable podium 15 feet away, her prepared remarks about sacrifice and remembrance forgotten mid-sentence. She had been watching the malfunction unfold with the sinking feeling of a ceremony going off script when this homeless-looking stranger, she'd mentally categorized him that way when she'd noticed him near the coffee tent earlier, walked into the formation and took command as if he still owned it. His field jacket was worn shiny at the elbows, missing a cuff button. His jeans were frayed at the hem above cracked work boots. But his movements with that rifle had been exact, his verbal command delivered with the kind of confidence that came from muscle memory drilled in over years, not improvised in a moment of crisis. Sergeant Nolan, who had been coordinating the combined honor guard from the city police and National Guard, stood near the rope barrier with his hand half raised, caught between intervening and witnessing. He'd noticed this man earlier hovering near the perimeter, had even politely but firmly asked him to stay behind the rope line where the public belonged. Now he watched as the older man stepped backward from the formation without fanfare, clearly intending to fade back into the rows of folding chairs and standing spectators. The ceremonial team stood at attention, waiting for Whitfield to continue the program, but several of the younger guardsmen threw quick sideways glances at the man who had just corrected their drill with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. The park itself was modest, a central paved plaza surrounding a low granite monument that listed names of local residents killed in wars stretching back to World War I. Small American flags had been pushed into the grass around its base that morning by volunteers. A permanent flagpole stood behind it, the flag snapping in the November breeze at full staff. Temporary folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows facing a small aluminum stage with a simple podium and 2 microphones. Off to one side, under a white canopy tent, long tables held coffee urns, stacks of paper cups, boxes of donuts, and informational brochures from the VA and local veterans organizations. Another table nearby had sign-in sheets for veterans wanting to connect with services. The air was cold enough that breath showed in small clouds when people spoke. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot as the crowd shifted weight, waiting for the program to resume. The smell of coffee mixed with damp earth and the faint exhaust from the nearby arterial road carried on the wind. Whitfield cleared her throat and stepped back to the microphone, signaling a brief pause under the pretense of adjusting the sound system. She caught Nolan's eye and made a small beckoning gesture. He approached, and she leaned close enough to speak without being picked up by the microphone. "Who is he?" Her voice was level but insistent. Nolan shrugged slightly. "Saw him near the coffee earlier. Didn't think he was important." A volunteer from the Veterans Information Table, an older woman named Margaret Shun, who had been setting up brochures all morning, overheard and stepped closer. He asked me where the Veterans Service Officer would be. Signed a contact sheet. Name was Daniel P. Rourke, I think. Wrote it down himself. Whitfield's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the kind of micro-change that came from a name triggering something half-remembered but not yet fully placed. She filed it away and returned to the podium, continuing the formal program. A speech about the meaning of service, the reading of names from the monument, a wreath laying by the local VFW post. But every few moments, her eyes tracked back toward the rear of the crowd where Rourke now stood quietly, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, his gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance. Before anyone could decide what to do about him, the story of who Daniel Rourke used to be was already walking toward the surface. Daniel Patrick Rourke hadn't always been the man in the worn jacket at the edge of the park. In 1968, at 20 years old, he'd been a private in the United States Army, fresh from Airborne school at Fort Benning with wings tattooed on his left forearm as proof. He'd shipped to Vietnam in September of that year, assigned to 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, 173rd Airborne Brigade, one of thousands of young men funneled into a war that had already been grinding through its 4th year. He'd arrived nervous, unsure, carrying an M16 that still felt foreign in his hands despite weeks of training. By 1970, he was Staff Sergeant Daniel P. Rourke, call sign Razor-26, leading a 9-man squad through triple canopy jungle with the kind of steady competence that made officers trust his judgment and privates want to be in his fire team. The call sign had come from a training exercise in the spring of 1969, when his squad had been tasked with cutting a path through particularly dense jungle faster than any other unit in the battalion. Instead of hacking blindly or pushing through with brute force, Rourke had paced them carefully, using machetes only where necessary, moving along natural gaps in the undergrowth, maintaining constant security. They completed the route in half the expected time without leaving a messy trail or compromising their defensive posture. The platoon leader, a lieutenant from Pennsylvania who appreciated efficiency, had joked over the radio that they moved like a razor blade through the jungle, trimming away obstacles without leaving a mess behind. The 2-6 was standard, 2nd platoon, 3rd squad leader, but razor stuck. By the time Rourke rotated home in late 1971, the call sign had appeared in after-action reports, commendation citations, and the kind of informal respect soldiers gave to leaders who brought their men back alive. He'd earned that respect through 3 operations that became teaching examples in battalion briefings. On June 4, 1969, near Hill 937 in the A Shao Valley, his squad had been running a night listening post 600 meters forward of the defensive perimeter. Just after midnight, Rourke had detected movement where none should have been, low voices, the deliberate spacing of feet on soft ground. Instead of opening fire immediately and giving away their position, he'd counted silhouettes in the dark, listened to the cadence, and realized from the way they moved that this was a probing force, not a random patrol. He'd quietly called his platoon radio operator on a secure frequency, provided rapid grid corrections, and requested pre-registered artillery illumination followed by high explosive rounds. When enemy scouts moved closer, he'd initiated a controlled burst to fix them in place, then adjusted fire in tight brackets. The engagement had lasted less than 20 minutes. Intelligence later estimated that his squad's actions had broken up a planned company-sized night assault on the hill, preventing dozens of friendly casualties. His calm, precise fire orders under pressure were taught in later briefings as a textbook example of small unit leadership. On February 12, 1970, near Quang Ngai Province, a light observation helicopter had taken ground fire during low-level reconnaissance and gone down in a patchwork of rice paddies and hedgerows. Rourke's squad had been closest. Ordered to locate survivors and secure the site, He led his men forward along a narrow dike, rather than taking the obvious straight route through an open field that could have been pre-sighted by enemy mortars. As they'd moved, he'd spotted disturbed vegetation and carefully placed tripwires near the wreck. He'd halted the squad, rerouted them through a drainage ditch, and moved to the helicopter from the blind side. 2 crewmen had been wounded, but alive. While his men suppressed a nearby tree line, Rourke had personally dragged one pilot with a leg wound back to cover and coordinated a makeshift landing zone. A medevac helicopter had hovered long enough to lift both crewmen out. The after-action report credited his route selection and tripwire detection with preventing a likely ambush on the responding ground force. 2 lives saved, 0 friendly casualties. The kind of quiet competence that didn't make headlines but kept men breathing. On October 3, 1970, at Firebase Lambert southwest of Da Nang, a pre-dawn mortar and ground probe had targeted the ammo storage area with disturbingly accurate fire. Rourke's squad section had been responsible for a sector that included a vulnerable stretch of wire on a steep slope. When illumination popped and he'd seen movement near a breach in the perimeter, he'd redistributed his squad without waiting for detailed orders from higher. He'd placed his 2 least experienced men behind sandbagged fighting positions where they could provide suppressing fire, then pulled his most seasoned rifleman and grenadier into a 3-man fire team to cover a likely approach gully. When the enemy pushed a sapper team toward the wire, his trio had used overlapping fields of fire and well-placed grenades to break the attack before they reached the inner perimeter. The contact had sent enemy casualties tumbling back down the slope and prevented a breach at a critical point. The battalion commander later cited his initiative as the deciding factor in holding that sector. Among his peers and subordinates, Rourke had been described as steady, never loud until he needed to be, and the guy you want on the line when it got bad. He'd ended up with a Silver Star for the night contact, near Hill 937, and 2 Bronze Stars with V device for valor. His personal philosophy, drilled into him by a platoon sergeant at Fort Benning, had been simple: leave no one behind. In Vietnam, it had been literal: bodies, wounded, equipment, everyone accounted for. Then came March 17, 1971, in the foothills near the A Shao Valley. Rourke's squad had been tasked with a day-long reconnaissance in force along a logging trail that intelligence believed was being used as an infiltration route. The plan had been straightforward: move out from Patrol Base Echo at first light, push 3 kilometers to a known crossroads, check for recent activity, and return before dusk. 9 men, including his radio operator and closest friend, Specialist Mikey Alvarez, a 21-year-old from El Paso who had been with him for nearly a year. They'd carried standard loads, full magazines, grenades, a PRC, 25 radio, rations, and a claymore for contingency. The weather had been humid, low clouds clinging to the hills, recent rain making the ground soft and slick under decaying leaves. By late morning, they'd moved about 2 kilometers. The jungle had been thick enough that visibility was 10 to 15 meters at best. The trail narrowed along a slope, dropping sharply off to the right into tangled undergrowth. Rourke had moved second in line behind his point man. He noticed the usual signs of the jungle: dripping leaves, the occasional bird call, but something had felt unusually quiet. No insect hum near a small drainage crossing, the kind of silence that made him tighten his grip on the rifle. He tapped a warning on the point man's shoulder to slow the pace. The first sign had been a muffled metallic clink from ahead and slightly above them, out of place in natural terrain. Before he could finish the half-whispered command to back up, the world had snapped white with the concussive blast of a command-detonated mine on the trail ahead. The point man, Private First Class Leonard Brooks, 19 years old, had disappeared into a cloud of dirt and shredded foliage. The blast wave had hit Rourke in the chest, driving air from his lungs and slamming him sideways into a tree trunk. He'd heard the high-pitched whine in his ears as secondary small arms fire erupted from the left flank, muzzle flashes stuttering between tree trunks. He'd smelled the sharp sting of explosive residue mixed with fresh torn earth and rotting vegetation. The air had filled with a fine mist of dirt and leaves. Trying to force breath back into his lungs, he'd felt the hot sting in his right thigh where metal had torn through flesh. The taste of copper had filled his mouth as he'd bitten the inside of his cheek when he'd hit the ground. Mikey's voice had cut through the noise for a split second. "I got you, Sarge." Then another explosion, smaller but close, likely a grenade. The radio had hissed and crackled as someone tried to key it. Over it all had come the distinct crack of AK fire, sharper than their own rifles. Rourke had dragged himself behind a termite mound, forcing his vision to focus, counting the gaps in the tree line where the fire was coming from, trying to shout orders over the ringing in his ears. Mikey had been moving to pull Rourke deeper into cover when a burst of automatic fire caught him across the torso. He dropped, still partially gripping the radio handset. The PRC-25 had taken additional rounds and gone dead. Rourke, bleeding and partially deaf, had tried to crawl to him when the initial enemy fire slackened. He'd managed to reach him, apply a field dressing, and attempt rescue breaths, but Alvarez's chest wound had been too severe. Rourke had known he was gone when Mikey's eyes stopped tracking and the shallow attempts at breathing ceased. Private Thomas "Tommy" Reed, 20 years old, had died from shrapnel and chest wounds during the initial blast. Corporal James Frazier, 22, had been wounded but survived. 3 Kia from Rourke's squad on that patrol. Despite shrapnel embedded in his right thigh and calf, a deep bruise and possible hairline fracture to 2 ribs from impact with a tree and temporary hearing loss, Rourke had organized the surviving men into a hasty defensive perimeter and directed suppressive fire while calling for artillery using a backup radio. They'd held their position for nearly 2 hours until a reaction force fought its way in. Rourke had refused evacuation until all remaining men had been counted, the dead located, and their bodies prepared for extraction. He'd last seen Mikey on a stretcher, face partially covered, boots still muddy from the same trail. Drop a comment if you've ever seen someone carry their burdens quietly, without drawing attention. Now back to the story. In the weeks following the incident, after initial recovery in a rear medical facility and subsequent return stateside, the nightmares had begun. Rourke would wake up in base housing and later in a small apartment, convinced he was still on that logging trail, the sound of the mine blast replaying with perfect clarity. He'd smell damp soil and cordite, even though his window looked out over a quiet American street. Flashbacks were triggered by sudden loud noises, backfiring cars, construction equipment, fireworks. His heart would race, and he'd drop to a knee or instinctively scan for cover before he realized where he was. He woke drenched in sweat several nights a week. His girlfriend at the time tried to shake him out of it and was met with a flailing arm once. He never forgave himself for the bruise on her forearm. He avoided crowds, especially in enclosed spaces. At a friend's wedding, the clatter of dropped plates made him flinch so hard he knocked over a chair. He left the Army in 1971 and taken a job as a mechanic at an auto shop, a natural fit for his practical skills. But he'd struggled with concentration. He'd find himself staring at a brake assembly, lost in a mental replay of grid coordinates and casualty counts. He'd missed minor details. Once he'd forgotten to tighten a lug nut fully. The customer had returned angry but unharmed. His boss had warned him. He'd married briefly in the late 1970s. His wife, Susan, had wanted stability, children, a predictable life. Rourke's anger had surfaced in small outbursts, slamming doors, raising his voice when startled. He'd never hit her, but the tension had worn them down. She'd urged him to seek help. He'd eventually gone to a VA clinic. He'd seen a therapist who had never deployed, who earnestly tried but relied heavily on textbooks and structured worksheets. Rourke had struggled to connect. He'd been prescribed prazosin to help with nightmares, which reduced their intensity somewhat, and later sertraline. The medication had dulled his emotions to the point where he'd felt detached from everything, so he'd stopped taking it without telling anyone. Paperwork delays and appeals over disability ratings had dragged on. Appointment schedules had shifted. He'd show up and be told his counselor had been reassigned. Each interaction had felt transactional and impersonal. His marriage had dissolved quietly in 1983. No final dramatic fight, just accumulated distance and a signed set of papers. By the late 1990s, after a series of short-term jobs, warehouse work, part-time maintenance, security guard shifts, his ability to hold steady employment had eroded. In 1999, while working nights as a security guard in an office park, a group of teenagers had set off firecrackers nearby. Rourke had dropped behind a concrete pillar, hard hammering, weapon half drawn from its holster before he'd realized there was no real threat. The company had reviewed security footage. Though he hadn't hurt anyone, they deemed him unreliable under stress and let him go. Losing that job had been the pivot. Rent had fallen behind. He'd tried informal labor, but his leg pain had worsened and standing all day had become difficult. In 2001, after his landlord posted a final eviction notice, he'd packed what he could into a worn backpack. A change of clothes, a cheap sleeping bag, a small hygiene kit, Mikey Alvarez's dog tags and address book, and his own DD-214 copy. He'd left a small box of possessions with his ex-wife for their adult daughter Lisa, including some photos and medals. He hadn't said goodbye in person. Shame over his situation and a belief that they were better off without his volatility had kept him from knocking on their door. He'd told himself he'd get stable and then return. Over the next 15 years, Rourke had cycled between shelters and the street. He'd spent several winters in a city shelter, summers under an overpass near Exit 14, where there was partial cover from wind and a reliable spot where churches parked vans for outreach. He'd learned the schedule of local soup kitchens and VA outreach events. He hadn't panhandled aggressively. He preferred odd jobs, helping unload trucks for a few dollars cash, cleaning up after events. He kept Mikey's dog tags wrapped in a cloth at the bottom of his backpack and wore his own tags under his shirt. He sometimes fingered them when fireworks crackled in the distance, grounding himself in the metal's familiar shape. He'd refused to sell or pawn anything connected to his service, even when he'd considered selling his old field jacket for a few bucks. A regular volunteer at a church, Pastor Jim Collins, often spoke with him, offered coffee, and encouraged him to follow up with the VA. Sometimes he did. Other times, the thought of retelling everything again kept him away. In late October, a laminated flyer had gone up on the bulletin board at the shelter where Rourke signed it some nights. It announced the city's Veterans Day ceremony at Memorial Park, color guard, guest speakers, reading of names, and complimentary coffee and refreshments for veterans and families provided by local businesses. It also noted that VA representatives and a county veteran service officer would be present at an information table. Rourke had read it carefully. The mention of a veteran service officer had caught his eye. He'd had a partially completed disability claim that he'd abandoned years earlier because the paperwork felt overwhelming. Having someone in person to help appealed to him more than another 800 number call. Memorial Park also held a small stone monument with the names of local men killed in Vietnam. Rourke had once looked for Alvarez's name out of habit, even though he wasn't from this town. He hadn't found it, but he'd remembered staring at the list for a long time. Veterans Day pulled him there every year when he was within bus range. On the morning of November 11th, he'd taken an early city bus from near the shelter to a stop 2 blocks from Memorial Park. The ride had been less than 5 miles, but walking the whole way would have aggravated his leg. He'd arrived early, around 9:30 a.m., before the 11 a.m. ceremony. The air had been cold enough that his breath showed when he exhaled. He'd moved around the edges of the setup, staying out of the way of volunteers placing folding chairs, but close enough to see the honor guard rehearse. He didn't know that by simply wanting a cup of coffee and a chance to talk to a benefits officer, he was walking straight toward people who already knew his name, just not his face. When the rifle jammed and the formation wobbled, Rourke's response had been instinctive. He'd heard the misfire, noticed the young soldier's hands tighten around the weapon, recognized the particular feel of a blank fire malfunction in an M1 Garand, the spent casing catching in the ejection port, the bolt riding forward but not fully seating. He hadn't planned a dramatic entrance. He'd simply seen a safety and protocol problem in a public setting and moved to fix it the way he'd fixed 1,000 problems in the field. His hands had moved confidently, but not showily. He'd checked that the muzzle stayed in a safe direction, cycled the action with the practiced motion of someone who'd done it under fire, extracted the spent casing, checked the chamber, and reseated the clip properly. His verbal commands had used correct drill and ceremony language based on older manuals, slightly different phrasing than today's scripts, but still understood by trained troops. The crowd had noticed that something happened, but many hadn't fully understood what. The veterans in the audience, however, had tracked every movement. A few older men in service caps had nodded almost imperceptibly. Henderson's breathing had slowed as the drill resumed cleanly. His embarrassment was mixed with gratitude. Whitfield had finished the volley segment and quietly instructed a nearby staff sergeant to invite Rourke to the veterans' table after the ceremony. Nolan had remained cautious, but admitted quietly to the officer next to him. He knew exactly what he was doing. As the formal program wound down, the final speech, the benediction, the playing of taps through a portable speaker, people began drifting toward the coffee tent and information tables. Rourke approached the county veterans service officer with his folded DD 214 copy in hand, clearly more interested in sorting out paperwork than in talking about the rifle incident. He moved with the same controlled limp, favoring his right leg slightly, and stood to one side while the service officer finished helping an older Korean War veteran with a question about medical appointments. What would you have done in that moment? If you saw a ceremony starting to go off track, would you step forward like Danny did, or stay back? Let us know in the comments. Now back to the story. Whitfield walked over with Nolan a step behind, both of them still in their dress uniforms, ribbons and badges aligned correctly. She opened with a straightforward, non-dramatic question. "Sergeant, that was good work with the rifle. What's your name?" Rourke looked up, his pale blue eyes sharp despite the bloodshot rims, and replied quietly, "Rourke. Daniel. Staff sergeant a long time ago." He didn't embellish or offer additional information. He slid his DD 214 across the table to the service officer, who was waiting patiently. Whitfield's eyes caught the name printed on the form and the unit line. 2/503, 173rd Airborne. She asked permission to look, then checked the medals listed in the award section. Silver Star. Bronze Star with V device, twice. The combination of name, unit, and awards triggered a solid memory. Years earlier, as a major teaching a professional development class for junior officers, she'd used a Silver Star citation as an example of small unit leadership under pressure. The citation had described actions by a Staff Sergeant Daniel P. Rourke near Hill 937, night contact, precise artillery coordination, enemy company-size assault disrupted. She pulled out her phone and quietly searched an online database of Valor Awards maintained by a military history organization. Within minutes, she pulled up the same citation, reading enough to confirm details like dates and unit designations that matched the DD 214 in front of her. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, shoulders back, chin slightly raised. She addressed him not as Sir or Mr., but as Staff Sergeant Rourke, an intentional choice that carried weight. Nolan watched this change, processing that the same man he'd nudged away from the rope line an hour earlier had once been at the center of heavy combat. His expression moved from skepticism to something closer to respect. Before the coffee in his cup could cool, Danny's name was about to be read into a microphone for a very different reason than he'd expected. Whitfield stepped aside briefly, coordinating with the event organizer and asking for a few extra minutes at the end of the program for an unscheduled acknowledgement. She confirmed with the city's audio technician that the microphone would be available. She quietly shared the basics with Nolan: the citation, the unit, the awards. Nolan looked from the phone screen back to Rourke with a new level of processing visible on his face. Words spread in natural, small circles. Margaret Shunn, the volunteer at the veterans table, told another volunteer that the guy who fixed the rifle is a Silver Star recipient. Pastor Jim Collins, hearing Rourke's name mentioned, approached Whitfield and told her that he'd known Danny for years through church outreach and could vouch that he was the same person described in those records. The veteran service officer, working within privacy rules, verified the DD 214 against their internal system. confirming that this was indeed the same Daniel Patrick Rourke in their files. Meanwhile, Emily Alvarez, a 45-year-old high school counselor who had been packing her tote bag after the ceremony, overhears Rourke's name spoken along with his unit number. She paused, her hand halfway in her bag, then took out a folder she'd been carrying. She flipped to a photocopy of a partially redacted citation that mentioned Staff Sergeant Daniel P. Rourke in connection with actions that had allowed her father, Specialist Michael Javier Alvarez, and others to survive earlier missions before his final patrol. Her expression changed as she realized that the man from the story she'd grown up with, the squad leader her mother had mentioned, the name on that citation framed in their living room for years, was 15 yards away, sipping shelter coffee from a paper cup. When a microphone came back on, the ceremony everyone thought was overturned into something entirely unplanned, but entirely real. Whitfield returned to the small stage and asked politely for the crowd's attention for one more brief acknowledgement. Many people had already started toward the parking lot, but her tone carried enough authority that they paused. She explained, in straightforward language, that during the ceremony a member of the audience had stepped up to assist the rifle team and that, in speaking with him afterward, they discovered he was a former staff sergeant of the 173rd Airborne Brigade and a Silver Star recipient. She read basic facts from publicly available portions of his citation: the unit designation, the date, June 4th, 1969, and a general description of actions, near Hill 937 involving night contact, artillery coordination, and disruption of an enemy assault. She avoided embellishment, sticking to the official wording. She then asked Rourke, who was clearly uncomfortable with the attention, if he would be willing to step closer to the front so the crowd could see him. He hesitated, then moved forward slowly, his limp more pronounced as he walked across uneven ground. People turned. Some older veterans straightened, recognizing the unit name. A man in a 173rd Airborne ball cap removed it and held it over his heart. Applause started, not as a standing ovation choreographed for effect, but as a genuine, sometimes hesitant, sometimes strong response from those present. It built slowly, a few claps, then more than sustained. Rourke stood awkwardly near the edge of the small stage, his hands hanging at his sides, clearly wishing he could disappear back into the crowd. His face remained neutral, but his jaw tightened, and he swallowed hard. As the applause died down, Emily moved forward and asked quietly if she could speak for a moment. Whitfield weighed the request, then handed her the microphone after confirming she would keep it brief and relevant. Emily introduced herself with her full name, Emily Alvarez, and said that her father, Specialist Michael Javier Alvarez, had served in Vietnam with the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, and was killed in action in 1971. She explained that she'd grown up with a photocopy of part of a Silver Star citation framed in her living room, and that it had mentioned a Staff Sergeant Daniel P. Rourke, whose decisions in combat had allowed her father and others to survive long enough to complete earlier missions before his final patrol. She held up the folder she carried. Inside was the photocopy. She didn't read it word for word, but paraphrased a few lines, mentioning the date, the location, the unit designation. She turned toward Rourke and said that because of his actions on that documented day near Hill 937, her father had lived long enough to write the letters that she still owned, letters that helped her understand who he was. She mentioned that he'd been engaged when he deployed, and that her mother had later told her that if not for those additional months, if her father had died earlier in that tour, during one of the engagements that Staff Sergeant Rourke's leadership had helped them survive, Emily herself might not have been born. Her voice broke slightly as she continued. If he'd died earlier in that tour, I simply wouldn't be here. My 2 kids wouldn't be here. Dozens of my students at Lincoln High wouldn't have had me as their counselor these past 12 years. The point wasn't exaggerated. It was a straightforward chain of cause and effect. She held the photocopy in trembling hands, the paper creased from years of careful folding and unfolding. This citation has been in my family since I was 6 years old. I always wondered if I'd ever meet the man whose name was on it. I never thought I'd find him at a Veterans Day ceremony in a city park. Rourke listened, standing awkwardly at the front, his hands hanging at his sides. He didn't break down dramatically. Instead, His jaw tightened further, and he swallowed hard again. His eyes glistened, but no tears fell. When Emily finished, he simply said in his low, gravelly voice, "I remember your father. Mikey. He was solid. Best radio operator I ever had. He deserved better than he got." His voice cracked on the last word, but he held himself together. The crowd remained mostly quiet. A few people sniffled, but there was no orchestrated sobbing. Pastor Collins stood nearby, hands folded, his own eyes wet. Nolan, off to one side, looked down for a moment, visibly rethinking his earlier assumptions. Emily stepped off the small stage and closed the physical distance between them. She offered a handshake, which Rourke accepted, and then she pulled him into a brief, natural hug. He stiffened for a moment, then allowed it, one hand coming up to pat her shoulder once before stepping back. Whitfield took the microphone again, her own voice slightly unsteady. She stated clearly that Rourke was enrolled in VA care and that the veteran service officer on site would help him update and pursue his benefits, including housing assistance where eligible. She didn't promise miracles. She outlined actual available resources: HUD VSH vouchers, mental health services, case management through the VA's homeless veteran programs. She looked directly at Rourke and said, "Staff Sergeant, we don't leave people behind. That includes after the war is over." It wasn't a slogan. It was a direct, practical commitment within her authority as a battalion commander with connections to VA coordinators and local veteran service organizations. The crowd's response was a mix of sustained applause, people lining up to shake his hand, and some simply nodding at him as they passed. An older man in a Vietnam veteran cap gripped his hand and said, "Welcome home, brother." Finally, a woman thanked him for his service and pressed a business card into his hand, a local veterans advocacy group. The promises made were specific. Whitfield wrote her direct office number on the back of her card and told him to call the next morning. The veteran service officer scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday. At 2 p.m., Pastor Collins confirmed he'd give Rourke a ride. Margaret Chin from the information table wrote down contact information for 3 housing programs. Transportation was arranged for upcoming VA visits. For the first time in a very long time, Danny left an event with more commitments on paper than he could fit in his pockets, and people determined to make sure he showed up. If this story of quiet service and real-world responsibility means something to you, consider subscribing. We share true stories like this every week, honoring veterans not with fantasy, but with the truth of their lives. Now, let's see what happened next. That evening, Rourke sat at the shelter again, but this time he had a folder with printed appointment slips, business cards, and handwritten notes. Pastor Collins stopped by after his evening rounds and reviewed the appointments with him, helping him mark dates on a donated pocket calendar. Whitfield, after making some calls from her office, had initiated contact with the VA social worker assigned to homelessness outreach in their region. Separately, she'd used limited information from Rourke's emergency contact records, an old phone number that had been disconnected, but a name, Lisa Rourke, daughter, to locate his adult daughter through public databases and city records. She'd made a professional but personal call, explaining that her unit had encountered Daniel at the ceremony and that he was alive and reachable if Lisa wanted contact. The call had ended not with a promise, but with Lisa saying, "Let me think about it and talk to my husband." This has been a long time. 2 weeks later, Rourke was no longer sleeping under the overpass. He had a temporary bed in a transitional housing program coordinated through the VA and a local nonprofit. The room was in a converted apartment building with shared bathrooms and a communal kitchen, but it had a door that locked and a window that looked out over a small courtyard. He'd attended 2 medical appointments, one to evaluate his leg and overall health, where a doctor had noted advanced arthritis in his right hip and knee and prescribed physical therapy, another to reassess his mental health diagnosis and medication options, where a psychiatrist who'd spent time in Afghanistan listened more than talked and adjusted his prescription to a lower dose of sertraline combined with targeted therapy sessions. His appearance had changed modestly but noticeably. His beard was trimmed, his hair cut by a volunteer barber who visited the housing program weekly. He still wore the same field jacket most days, but he had a clean sweatshirt underneath donated by the church outreach program. He now had a set weekly schedule printed on a sheet of paper taped inside his room. Medical appointments on Tuesdays, a group therapy session on Thursdays, and a standing meeting with a case manager every Friday afternoon to navigate benefits paperwork. Some things remained difficult. Crowd still made him tense. He'd skipped one group session after a sleepless night filled with the old nightmare of the mind blast. But the case manager had followed up with a phone call rather than letting him disappear. That simple act, someone noticing he hadn't shown up and caring enough to check, meant more than he could easily express. 6 months later, Rourke had a small, sparsely furnished room in permanent supportive housing on the west side of town. There was a bed with a real mattress, a small table with 2 chairs, and a shelf with a few practical items. A coffee maker he'd bought at a thrift store, a small radio, a stack of paperback novels from the library. His DD 214 copy was now in a clearly labeled folder in a drawer, not folded in his pocket. A framed photo of his daughter and her 2 kids sat on the shelf. Lisa had brought it during her 3rd visit. They'd met cautiously at first, in a coffee shop near her work, talking mostly about concrete things. Her job as a medical office receptionist, his appointments, small memories from her childhood that weren't too painful to revisit. There were no sweeping apologies from either side, just incremental acknowledgments of past absences and current efforts. She'd invited him to a family dinner once, and he'd gone, sitting quietly at the table and playing a simple board game with his grandchildren afterward. He'd become an informal peer mentor in a weekly veterans group at the same shelter where he'd once only signed in for a bed. He didn't give long speeches or dramatic testimony. Instead, he sat with younger veterans after meetings, answering specific questions about how he managed certain triggers or why he finally accepted help. When one veteran, a former Marine in his 30s who deployed to Iraq twice, expressed fear of being a burden to his family, Rourke responded quietly, "We don't leave people behind. Not if we can help it. That goes for you too." The phrase landed differently now, not as a bitter reminder of failure, but as a working guideline for his role in this new part of his life. He still struggled. Fireworks on the 4th of July had sent him back to his room for 2 days. He'd missed an appointment once because the bus route confused him and he'd gotten off at the wrong stop, too proud to call for help until Pastor Collins tracked him down. But he showed up more often than he didn't, and the network around him, Whitfield, the case manager, Pastor Collins, Emily Alvarez, who checked in every few weeks, held steady. The final image came on the next Veterans Day. Rourke stood at Memorial Park again, this time with a volunteer badge clipped to his field jacket. His hair was fully gray now, neatly trimmed, and he'd gained 15 pounds of healthy weight. He helped a nervous young guardsman check his rifle before the salute, showing him the exact spot where casings sometimes caught and how to clear them safely. When the ceremony started, he stood in the back row of volunteers, hands clasped in front of him, listening to the speeches with the kind of quiet attention that came from someone who understood exactly what the words cost. He wasn't healed completely. He never would be. But he wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Daniel Rourke taught us that the phrase "leave no one behind" doesn't end when the war does. It extends to every veteran struggling in silence, every person carrying invisible wounds, every soul who served and then fell through the cracks. Subscribe for more stories honoring veterans, not with empty platitudes, but with the truth of their sacrifice and their ongoing battles. Another story is on screen now. Click it, watch it, and remember, the uniform may come off, but the responsibility to our brothers and sisters in arms never does. Thank you for watching.